Good evening, everyone. I would like to pay my respects to the Bejigal people, the original owners of the land on which we are gathered. I would also like to pay tribute to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. Given the great love that Mahatma Gandhi had for all disadvantaged people, I'm sure that if he lived in Australia today, his heart would go out to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, just as it went out to the most marginalized people in India, especially those whom he respectfully and affectionately called Harijans or Children of God. I'm honored to have the opportunity to make a few opening remarks at what promises to be an absolutely brilliant event. Let me first acknowledge the Honourable Michael Kirby AC CMG, who will be delivering the oration, Mr. Arun Kumar Goel, Consul-General of India, our hosts, Mr. David Gonski, AC, Chancellor, and Fred Hilmer, AO, Vice-Chancellor of UNSW, and Nihal Gupta, who is here representing the Premier Barry O'Farrell. Speaking in my capacity as a patron of the UNSW node of the Australia-India Institute, I thought it would be worth saying a few words on the background leading up to today's event, a story of some inspired ideas and gracious, even generous responses. It all began some 4 years ago with the inspired offer by the then Consul-General of India, Amit Dasgupta, to donate a bust of Mahatma Gandhi to UNSW, an offer that was immediately accepted by Vice-Chancellor Fred Hilmer. UNSW treated the installation of the bust with great respect and chose to locate it in a very central and prominent position in a beautiful architect-designed setting. The bust has become a focal point not only for Gandhi-related events, but also on other occasions, especially graduation ceremonies, with numerous students, both Indian and non-Indian, having their photographs taken alongside the Mahatma. The second inspired idea, again from Amit Dasgupta, was that UNSW host an annual Gandhi Oration to be delivered by a prominent resident of New South Wales whose life and work reflected the ideals that Gandhiji stood for. Once again, Fred Hilmer and UNSW responded positively and enthusiastically. With all modesty, I came up with the next inspired idea, which was to invite Pat Dotson, Australia's most respected Aboriginal leader, to deliver the inaugural oration. Pat accepted graciously and humbly and delivered what was a truly inspiring and moving oration on this day last year. It was a most auspicious and euphoric start, attended by 800 people or so, overflowing the Leighton Hall and requiring many to witness it at an adjacent venue on video screens. It was so successful that we felt extremely nervous about what we could do in 2013 to emulate the inaugural success. And then came the next inspired idea, this time from Jenny Lang, UNSW Vice President Advancement, who has been a tower of strength supporting all the India-related and Gandhi-related events on this campus, who approached the Honourable Michael Kirby to speak to us today. An invitation Michael immediately and graciously accepted. As I look out to an audience that has filled UNSW's largest venue to capacity, with the knowledge that there are a few hundred more in another hall nearby, certainly the biggest audience at any India-related event in Australia outside of a test match. But I know already that we are enjoying yet another phenomenal success. The Gandhi Oration is now well and truly on the Australian calendar as one of the most inspirational and prestigious events. We will need another inspired idea next year. Perhaps we should have a competition. May I now invite Fred Hilmer, the Vice-Chancellor of UNSW, to talk about the significance of these events for UNSW. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Neville, and a very warm welcome to the university, which is delighted to host this event and to forge what I think is going to become a really great tradition. At the outset, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners and particularly acknowledge our special guests, David Gonski, our Chancellor, the Honourable Michael Kirby and Mr. Johan von Vorten, Mr. Arun Kumar Goel, the Consul-General, and his wife, Alka Goel, Mr. Nihal Gupta, who is representing the Premier, and of course I'd like to acknowledge Neville Roach, who works tirelessly to create each event as a bigger and a better India-Australia event. As Neville said a number of times, these ideas were put to me and I immediately accepted. The expression in Australia is "went for it with ears pinned back." And why did I do that? Well, India and Australia are countries that could have a lot more in common than they do. A lot of our heritage is common, a lot of our understandings of the rule of law, legal systems is common, but I think, as Neville said, the real action occurs on the cricket pitch, and it doesn't yet occur to the same extent in terms of the exchange of ideas and learning and teaching that goes on and research in universities. It doesn't go on to the same extent in business, although we're on a very good trajectory. And in order to really see that relationship develop, we could immediately grab the idea of having a wonderful bust, which a number of you have seen and which has really become a very central part of not just days like this, but of many events around the university. And that bust is really the symbolic part of the relationship with India. But there's, of course, the business side, and that, I think I can fairly say, is going very well. We're right in the enrolment stage of the academic year right now, and we're really pleased to see a return of strong growth in students from India. And I think the students who come here and our students who visit there are really the building blocks of a relationship. And we'd like to see those numbers triple, but the numbers are going the right way. We've also deepened and broadened our research relationships with a number of the research-intensive Indian universities and institutes of technology. And there is a fund, the Australia-India Strategic Projects Fund, and we currently have 9 projects, more than any other university in that fund, and they cover subjects as diverse as nanotechnology, materials and energy. And I think, again, researchers working together and solving some of the big problems of research together is a way to really go beyond the cricket relationship. We also last year had an event that close to rivaled this in terms of the audience and the hall, and that was when we conferred an honorary doctorate on Dr. Ratan Tata in November, who gave really a wonderful talk, one of the leaders of Indian industry, again, really building a bridge and building understanding in terms of India. And then the one that maybe will have the most impact, and that was UNSW becoming the set for a Bollywood movie. It's called From Sydney with Love, and it follows the story of a young Indian scholarship student who came to study in Sydney at UNSW. And I urge all of you to see this movie, and particularly note the cameo appearance at the end of a Vice-Chancellor handing out a degree. So this event, the Gandhi Bust, the ongoing and growing interaction in research, in teaching and in events is a really important part of the relationship. And with that, I would really like to call on Mr. Arun Goel, the Consul, and invite him to speak on behalf of the Indian community.
Good evening. The Honourable Michael Kirby AC CMG, Chancellor Mr. David Gonski AC, President and Vice-Chancellor Professor Fred Hilmer AO, Mr. Neville Roach AO, Honourable guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am honoured to be present here today for the 2013 Gandhi Oration being organised by the University of New South Wales. After the installation of the Mahatma Gandhi's bust in 2010, the university has taken a lead in organizing events like the commemoration of Gandhi Jayanti Day, 2nd October, and the Martyrdom Day, 30th January, every year. The Gandhi Oration is one such event which the university started last year to take place every year on the 30th January. The subject of today's oration, What Would Gandhi Do Today? A meditative look at contemporary challenges of human rights, is very timely, relevant, and appropriate, considering what is happening in the world today, like the ghastly act of rape and violence that took place in New Delhi last month. We need to follow the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi today even more than ever, and also need to inculcate his teachings amongst the youth so that when they grow up, they have a different perspective and outlook on life and values other than what they are seeing today. The universities in Australia, especially in the UNSW, are playing a vital role in augmenting India-Australia relations, which are at their best in the current years. Foreign Minister Bob Carr was in New Delhi earlier this week to initiate discussions for a bilateral safeguards agreement on supply of uranium to India. NSW Premier Barry O'Farrell, who had publicly announced that he would visit India every year during his tenure, was in India in October-November 2012 when an agreement was signed for establishment of sister state relations between the Maharashtra state in India and New South Wales. He also announced travel concessions for international students up to a maximum of 35% on My Multi tickets, which have been operationalized from this month. It is a very welcome development, and I am sure the international students will take full advantage of this. I just hope that these concessions would be further enhanced and made applicable on my train and my bus tickets also at par with domestic students, as is being done in other states of Australia. I would urge all the universities in New South Wales to liaise with the NSW government to persuade it to accede to this long-standing demand of international students. Ladies and gentlemen, I am equally keen to listen to Honourable Michael Kirby for his views and visions on the subject of today's oration, and thank the university, especially Professor Hilmer, Mr. Neville Roach, Ms. Jenny Lang, Ms. Fiona Doherty, and other members of the team for organizing today's event. Thank you.
We're now down to the business end, and I would like to very briefly introduce the Honourable Michael Kirby, our speaker tonight. Michael has really been a wonderful leader as a judge, as a member of international commissions, as a thinker, as a writer, as a speaker. He is one of these national treasures, and one of the things you know about national treasures is everybody owns them. So he really belongs to UNSW. We have the Kirby Institute, Dr. David Cooper's here, and named after Michael, which does really groundbreaking research in AIDS. Michael is a visiting fellow in law. He's a member of the Law Advisory Council. He's also a member of the Dean's Circle in Medicine and an honorary Doctor of Laws from this university. And it gives me great pleasure to ask Dr. Michael Kirby to address us tonight.
Chancellor, Consul-General and members of the Diplomatic Corps, Vice-Chancellor, Professor David Cooper, the Director of the Kirby Institute, citizens of India, citizens of Australia and other countries, welcome to this special evening. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi lived and breathed the human life as we do. Yet his journey was extraordinary. It was caught up in the cause of liberty and independence for the people of the Indian subcontinent and earlier the people of South Africa. He's now, as the Consul-General has said, revered worldwide, including in Australia. Almost a century ago, he was named Mahatma, or Great Soul. That is how, for almost 100 years, he has been known to the world. Unlike earlier and later independence leaders, he set out to achieve his goals by a particular strategy: ahimsa, love, non-violence, pacifism. He mixed this technique with an infuriating cocktail of speeches, negotiations, writings, and great marches that in the end brought a vision of a better world to 2 subcontinents and eventually to all of humanity. As the world knows, he was assassinated on this day in 1948, 65 years ago. He is named the father of the Indian nation, but he belongs to the world, to humanity, and also to the larger biosphere of animal and plant life. I thank this university for inaugurating this lecture. The occasion gives Australians the opportunity to turn their minds to this great soul. He was fallible, he was paradoxical, he could be annoying, sometimes he was inconsistent, often puzzling, as all human beings are. This university has taken several steps of late to strengthen Australia's links with India, the world's most populous democracy. Those links have been neglected in the past. So let us therefore, on this anniversary night, reflect first upon Gandhi's life. Let us derive from his acts and words ideas to guide us in the very different world of the here and now. With such an amazing life and so many ideas and propositions, several of them contradictory, it would be easy to get lost in the search for Gandhian relevance. A lecturer, if wise, will choose a few themes only, as I will do, and seek guidance in the Mahatma's life and teachings that may help us today. Preferably, such themes should draw on the orator's own experience, so that that speaker with the audience can alike share and meditate upon this great man and endeavour to enlarge their own perceptions of the world we live in. So I have chosen 4 themes: women's rights, climate change, animal rights, and sex and human sexuality. Other speakers, other themes, but these will be mine. And first, we must remember the broad outlines of Gandhi's life. Where was he 100 years ago tonight? Where was he in 1913? The young Mohandas was born on the 2nd of October 1869 in the Bombay Presidency of British India. His father and his grandfather had served as officials in one of the small princely states. At the age of 13, he took part in an arranged marriage to 14-year-old Kasturba. After his father died, he was sent to England to train as a barrister so that he could pursue a similar life to that of his grandfather and father. Before he left India, he vowed to his mother to refrain from meat, to refrain from alcohol, and to refrain from promiscuity. After his call to the bar in England in 1891, he returned to India. 2 years later, he travelled on a short contract to South Africa, where he was to stay for 21 years. A moving aspect of a recent biography of the Mahatma by Jacob Ladyfeld is the description of the many places where Gandhi lived and worked in South Africa. They included a whitewashed courtroom where, a century ago exactly, he was convicted and imprisoned for leading Indian miners and sugar workers on a long walk of protest against racist laws. He became caught up in the struggle of the Indian community in South Africa, Hindu and Islamic, seeking to retain the vote and their equality as British subjects in that country. Voting was to be withdrawn from them in one of the early instances of racist legislation there. Increasingly, Gandhi became engaged in the political negotiations, and to win British support for Indian claims for the continuance of equal nationality rights with the whites, he led a detachment of Indian stretcher bearers volunteering to serve in a British war against the Zulu kingdom. The display of British military power and organisation which he saw caused him to adjust his ideas of how to negotiate with the British and to outsmart them by techniques of non-violent protest. It can, I think, be said that he was fortunate in the adversary that he had to confront, both in South Africa and India. In South Africa at this time, a century ago, he met a German Jewish architect from Königsberg in East Prussia, Hermann Kallenbach. By 1908, they were living together, and I will return later to this period in his life. A century ago, Gandhi was in the midst of organising indentured Indian mine and sugar workers effectively to join with white miners in a strike for better conditions. He organised a great walk with thousands of men, women and children. Eventually, in tribute to his skills, not only in organising the walk but feeding the multitudes, he was arrested and charged with criminal offences. Eagerly, he pleaded guilty to each charge in that small, whitewashed courthouse. Mass arrests followed, and when Gandhi emerged after 5 weeks in prison, he said sweetly that he would miss the solitude and peace of jail and the opportunity that it had given him for reflection. Gandhi worked for the Indian community. He didn't exchange his campaign at that time for the blacks. Soon after, as if in reward, the White Parliament of South Africa enacted the Indian Relief Act, and he departed with that victory under his belt from South Africa with Kallenbach, never to return. They arrived by ship in Southampton the day after the Great War began in August 1914. Kallenbach was quickly detained as an enemy alien. Eventually, he was deported to Germany, being exchanged for a British prisoner taken in war. And the two men, Gandhi and Kallenbach, didn't meet again until 1937 in India. Gandhi himself returned to India, fired up by his experiences in South Africa. He quickly achieved leadership of the Indian National Congress. He then embarked upon a series of brilliant moves that were ultimately to secure independence from Britain in 1947. He led, for example, a huge peaceful process in the form of the Great Salt March in 1930. By 1935, the British had begun to pave the way for India to move to Dominion status within the British Empire. But the advent of war in 1939 put those moves on hold. This resulted in Gandhi's demand that Britain quit India. Thousands were arrested, including Gandhi himself, during the Quit India campaign. Released from prison in 1944, Gandhi called off the Quit India struggle to the huge consternation of the Congress leadership. Immediately, 100,000 political prisoners were released by the British. At the end of the war in 1945, more difficult adversaries emerged whom even Gandhi couldn't charm, persuade or reconcile. The leader of the Muslim League in India, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, demanded a separate state of Pakistan, and the leaders of the Congress, Nehru and Patel, would not agree to a loose Indian federation because they feared that this would undermine the strong central government that they believed was necessary to achieve the rapid economic and social development essential to bring India into the modern age. His killing by a Hindu nationalist in 1948, following the partition of India, was the very antithesis of the non-violence for which he had stood. Every Indian knows the foregoing story. They do so from his autobiography written in 1927-29, from countless books, films, documentaries, by teaching in their schools and by word of mouth. Many Australians have only the most general knowledge of their own history, in which there has never been and has never been the need for a national leader quite like Gandhi. It is as well, when we look into Gandhi's life for guidance in our lives, that we realise the very different world in which he grew up, developed, struggled and died. "I live for India's freedom," he said, "and I would die for it because it is part of truth. Only a free India can worship the true God. India's freedom, as conceived by me, can never be a menace to the world. My goal is friendship with the whole world, and I can combine the greater love with the greatest opposition to wrong." It's appropriate to begin my reflections on contemporary issues and Gandhian thought by looking, as the Consul-General has essentially invited, to the question of women's rights. Women constitute half of humanity, and everywhere they suffer discrimination and disadvantage inflicted upon them by laws, customs and cultural rules that have overwhelmingly been made by men. Attention has been drawn to violence and discrimination against women in India by a terrible event that happened in Delhi on the 16th of December 2012. A young woman and her male companion boarded a bus in South Delhi only to be assaulted by the 5 passengers already on board. The woman was raped by the male passengers. Her companion was knocked unconscious. Her body was sexually invaded with a metal object that had been used to assault her friend, and eventually both victims were thrown out of the moving bus. A passer-by quickly contacted the Delhi police on a cell phone. The woman was given emergency care at a hospital in Delhi. She was flown to emergency care in Singapore, where she succumbed to her injuries on the 29th of December 2012. Meantime, on the 21st of December, 6 suspects, including the bus driver, were arrested. They have been charged with criminal offences. Those offences are now before the courts of India. A number of advocates, when asked to accept briefs for the accused, refused. Rightly, the Chief Justice of India appealed for them to be properly represented by the bar. Senior advocates of the Supreme Court of India immediately volunteered their services. No person in India or Australia is guilty by accusation or by media campaigns or even international outrage. Guilt is decided in independent courts and in accordance with law. Sadly, cases of this kind, so-called gang rapes, are well known in Australia and virtually all other countries. They're certainly not confined to India. On the 11th of September 1886 in Sydney, not far from here, 16-year-old Mary Jane Hicks was set upon in Moore Park and brutally raped after a cab driver took her to scrubland. She was repeatedly penetrated by 9 young men. At the time, persons found guilty of rape were liable to be sentenced to death. In the Sydney case, the accused were jointly tried. All of them were between 17 and 22 years of age. The trial was held in the Central Criminal Court that still graces Taylor Square in Darlinghurst. The trial judge was Justice Windeyer and a jury of 12. 9 of the accused were convicted, although the jury added a recommendation of mercy. The judge sentenced all of them to death. The cabman was also found guilty for his part in the crime, and he was sentenced to 14 years imprisonment with hard labour and 2 floggings. The Governor of New South Wales spared 5 of the 9 youths, but the remainder were hanged. Mary Hicks left Australia for New Zealand, and none of the other offenders served less than 10 years imprisonment. So before Australians get too self-righteous about the recent events in Delhi, they should remember the history of their own society, past and recent. Violence against women, including sexual violence, you see, is an endemic problem throughout the world. And nowadays, to its perils, are added the danger of transmission of HIV and AIDS. News of the Delhi event and its aftermath led to huge protests in New Delhi and other Indian cities. 2 official inquiries were immediately established, one headed by the former Chief Justice J.S. Verma. This was mandated to promptly propose amendments to the criminal law to deal more effectively with sexual assault cases than had been done in the past. The other, by the former High Court judge in the Delhi High Court, Usha Mehra, was established to report on any official responsibility in relation to the incident. The leader of the opposition, responding to public outrage, reportedly declared in the Lok Sabha that the rapists should be hanged. However, the Australian case and many others show that liability to hanging does not necessarily deter or prevent such offences. It's the risk of detection and speedy and proper determination of guilt that does so. The report of the Verma inquiry has now been delivered. It's made a number of proposals, including for an increase in available penalties. Wisely, in my view, it held back from recommending the restoration of the death penalty. The police are relying on DNA evidence gathered in the bus to sustain their prosecutions of the accused men. What would Gandhi, father of the nation, have said about such an offence, save to condemn the brutality and disrespect for women that it evidenced? Gandhi wrote a great deal about women and about their role in the India that he hoped for. Thus he said, "I am firmly of an opinion that India's salvation depends on the sacrifice and enlightenment of her women." Many of his statements in the manner of that time were a mixture of enlightenment and tradition. "My own opinion," he said, "is that men and women are one. The problem must be one, their problems must be one in essence. The soul in both is the same. The two live the same life. They have the same feelings. Each is a complement of the other. They cannot live without the other's active help. But somehow or other man has dominated women from the ages past, and so women have developed an inferiority complex. Still, there's a vital difference between the two. Hence, the vocations of the two must also be different. She is passive, he is active. She is essentially mistress of the house, he is the breadwinner. She is the keeper and distributor of the bread. But if I were born a woman, I would rise in rebellion against any pretension on the part of a man that woman is bound to be his plaything. I could not steal my wife's heart until I decided to treat her differently than I used to do. And so I restored to her all her rights by dispossessing myself of all my so-called rights as her husband." In an extended passage, Gandhi once addressed violence against women, a phenomenon well known in societies with which he was acquainted. Quote, "Where a woman is assaulted, she may not stop to think in terms of a hisma. Her primary duty is self-protection. She's at liberty to employ every method or means that comes to her mind in order to defend her honour. God has given her nails and teeth. She must use them with all her strength." Many of Gandhi's statements, written in later life, as I will show, indicated a growing abhorrence on his part of sex. This was an attitude that grew with him during his lifetime. However, he lived in the real world. He knew of the violence, often sexual, that was visited on women. He admired those women who defended themselves against such violence. According to reports, this was done by the young woman who was assaulted in Delhi. Some of Gandhi's writings embraced a mythology that rural areas were somehow pure and virtuous places, which held the authentic spirit of the country. Bharat, for India, is akin to the bush in Australia. Gandhi embraced this mythology with constant declarations that the soul of the nation lived in India's villages. Media might now proclaim that Delhi is the rape capital of the world. However, regional and rural areas in India, as in our own country, can sometimes be intensely patriarchal. The cities can sometimes enlarge women's liberation unless exceptional events occur. Gandhi's supreme intelligence would, I believe, have set his mind searching for the kinds of solutions to the endemic problems that greet women and some men, so that they're treated as little more than a sexual object to be used, invaded, and then discarded as a thing or object. If Gandhi's instinctive and primary response to such conduct was his repeated call for chastity and celibacy, his realism would have led him to explore some of the underlying causes and attitudes that give rise to these patterns of brutal acts. A recent book by Mara Fistenhull called Unnatural Selection addresses the serious interference in the global sex ratio that's been caused by modern practices of sex selection. This practice is specially present in India, but not only in India. Quote, "At the turn of the millennium, Indian census figures showed 111 boys born for every 100 girls. At first glance, the experiences of the village nurses and orphanage workers helped explain the disparity, and indeed many foreign press reports blamed India's dearth of girls on infanticide and abandonment. Looking into the matter, however, this was only a very small part of the story. Outside a pocket of rural districts, Indians rarely killed infants. The Northwest, a wealthy region, considered India's breadbasket, reported in the census a regional sex ratio at birth of 126 boys to every 100 girls. So the real cause for the gap was that pregnant women were taking advantage of cheap and persuasive sex determination techniques, ultrasound, and aborting female fetuses. If Asia's overall sex ratio were normal, the Asian continent would have an additional 163 million females. 163 million females. The danger that lies in these figures is that if they continue, many young heterosexual men in Asia will not be able to find female marital and sexual partners, although desiring them. Apart from resort to sex workers, they'll be living in a world of many more men than there are women. If this continues, it will add to the dangers faced by women. Gandhi might appeal for chastity and celibacy, but the world's experience everywhere demonstrates the urgent demand and need for sexual outlets. A recent report from Columbia University and Seoul National University in Korea hints that in China and South Korea, the levels of ratios have peaked at 119 and 116 to 100 respectively, and the ratios are now pulling back in new births. However, there's no evidence, of which I'm aware, of a similar downward turn in India. None of this, of course, is to excuse violence against women or rape. It's merely to look, as Gandhi often did, to underlying causes behind individual conduct, so as to understand how the particular trends are happening in the general community. But what of climate change? Bangladesh, on India's doorstep in the east, and Mumbai in the west, India's financial capital, have suffered serious instances of dangerous floodings in recent years. Exceptional weather patterns, including in Australia, seem to be associated with climate change. Only recently, I've become involved in an international group of judges and lawyers looking at the issues of climate change from the standpoint of international law and its principles. The first meeting of that group took place in the Supreme Court of the Netherlands in The Hague in December 2012. It prepared a first draft of overarching global principles for environmental protection. Naturally, I ask, what would Gandhi say and do in such a group? The environmental movement was not established as such during Gandhi's lifetime. However, his ethical principles, as they evolved, carried lessons concerning the desirable limits to growth, the need for greater simplicity and self-discipline on human beings' part, and the necessity to view animals and all living things as entitled to human respect. In a real way, Gandhi evolved into a symbol of extreme individual self-sufficiency. Famously, even before he left South Africa, he had resumed the wearing of simple Indian clothing. Thereafter he dressed in a dhoti, and for this later condemnation of modernity, extending on his part to railways and industry, Gandhi earned the scorn of some critics. For one so skilled in moving about India to organise demonstrations, they said, it ill behoved him to condemn the modern instruments and means of his own very success. Gandhi's outlook on what we would call today the environment of the biosphere was profoundly influenced by his upbringing in Hinduism and Jainism. His mother extracted those three promises from him in front of a Jain monk. When a great earthquake struck Bihar in India in 1934, Gandhi declared that it was seismic karma. He claimed it was a divine chastisement for the great sin we've committed. This led his admirer, the Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore, to dissent. Gandhi referred repeatedly to God and invoked God in many of his utterances. It would be easy, of course, to conclude that he was simply anti-scientific or indulging in rhetorical exaggeration. Nonetheless, he was appalled by the extreme poverty and hunger that surrounded him both in South Africa and India. He saw the urgent need for corrections, to terminate gender inequality, to enforce universal primary education, which to their shame the British had not established in India in their time, to reduce child mortality, and to reject extreme wastefulness of much modern living. All of these instructions strike a modern chord, even if his extreme solutions for them, travelling half naked, spinning his own cloth, grinding his own grain, were not really feasible or even perhaps desirable in the modern world. So we must look on Gandhi as the supreme propagandist. In the unfolding age that he witnessed of modern media, he realised the power of symbols, of simple stories, of images, and that those images could burrow away in human consciousness. But one can perceive the wisdom of his cautionary message to humanity about ecological restraint. Then there's animal rights. Gandhi, through his mother, derived many of his values from the Jain traditions, and this led to his embrace of vegetarianism and a demand for respect for animals that, with human beings, make up the planet. As a young boy, Gandhi looked with mixed feelings of distaste and admiration upon the British rulers of India. He witnessed their strong armies and he saw their uncorrupted institutions. Part of him wanted to embrace their sources of power and to use them eventually to rid his country of them. In his autobiography, he wrote this: "It began to grow on me that meat eating was good, that it would make me strong and daring, and that if the whole country took up meat eating, the English could be overcome. Whenever I had occasion to indulge in these superstitious feasts, dinner at home was out of the question. I would tell my mother, 'I've no appetite today. There's something wrong with my digestion.' I knew I was lying, and lying to my mother. Therefore I said to myself, though it's essential to eat meat and essential to take up food reform, yet deceiving and lying to one's father and mother is worse than not eating meat. In their lifetime, therefore, meat eating must be out of the question. When they are no more, and I have found my freedom, I'll eat meat openly. But until that moment arrives, I will abstain from it, and I've never gone back to eating meat." When he went to England to study law, Gandhi was elected to the executive of the Vegetarian Society. This also led him into contact with a Theosophical Society. Its beliefs, in the common roots of all the great religions, was to affect his spirituality profoundly. The attempts of friends to put him under pressure to convert him to Christianity, the religion of India's then rulers, had no more success than the attempt to convert him to eating meat. He constantly talked about the abhorrence he felt for the cruel slaughter of animals. He believed that vegetarian was a kind of rational progression to a higher plane that human beings were bound eventually to embrace. Man, he said, man has moved from being a nomad. He settled down to civilized, stable life, founded villages and towns, and from members of a family, he became members of a community. All these are signs of progressive ahisma. Giving up meat was part of a natural progression. Now, I don't believe that there's any chance that human beings in Australia or other countries are going to suddenly embrace vegetarianism en masse. Gandhi himself found it hard to live on the boiled vegetables served to him by his English landlady in London, and impossible at that time to find vegetarian restaurants in the city. Although things have improved, equally, meat eating has greatly expanded in recent decades. In Asian countries, where meat was once a rarity of tiny proportions, it's now part of the staple diet. Even Japan has switched, following its infatuation with meat-eating habits of its American occupiers. In my childhood, in Australia, chicken was a very rare treat reserved to Christmas. Now it's a huge corporatised industry. Those most sociable of animals, poultry, are subjected to mass slaughter on an assembly line, or they're kept in tiny confines for egg production. If you ever want to see a site like Belsen in the midst of Australia, go to a chicken slaughter farm, as I once did. The large door is wheeled open, and thousands of heads silently turn to peer out of the gloom. For nearly 4 years, I've eaten no meat and no poultry. With John Coetzee, the Nobel laureate, we have become patrons of Voiceless, the animal welfare organisation. I still lapse with a little fish, and I can't persuade my partner of 44 years, Johan, to join in my conversion. Although the practicalities of the kitchen have reduced his intake of meat, I'm pleased to say. Of course, there is a theory that the human jaws developed to accommodate our carnivore habits, and that the human brain expanded because of the rapid ingestion of protein from other animal species. But with that brain expansion has come a larger moral sensibility. We will not all become Jains, but I hope that increasing numbers in the West, including Australia, and large numbers of returning people in Asia will at least reduce their meat intake. That is what Gandhi would say. Doing this would be good for our health. Cutting up the bodies of sentient creatures to eat their body parts isn't necessary for nutrition, still less essential. And Gandhi was one of the world's most visible symbols of healthy vegetarianism of the traditional Buddhist and Hindu beliefs. Once again, he had the idea, and he laid it before others as a moral instruction. Now, of course, Hitler was also a vegetarian, so it's no guarantee of rectitude. But it is, I suggest, a subject for increasing reflection to reduce the corporatised slaughter of animals. In meat-exporting countries like Australia, the very least that we must insist on and legislate for and enforce is strict conditions to enlarge as far as possible the acceptability of the farming and slaughtering process. Sentient animals see, smell, hear, feel fear. Fear there will always be in slaughter, but we can learn from Gandhi to respect and protect the other sentient creatures that share this planet with us. But what of Gandhi and sexuality? As befits a leader who was part spiritualist and part politician, Gandhi thought and wrote a great deal about sex. But in this regard, he was different from all other leaders of his time. In the first half of the 20th century and beyond, especially in the English-speaking world, there was a great deal of hypocrisy about, and even amongst educated people's views, having established ostensible revulsion towards so-called unnatural sex. This was regarded as alien to the manly and conquering ethos of the British Empire. In the 19th century in Britain, intellectual leaders such as Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, began to question the old statutory offences for adult, private, consensual acts. But when Thomas Babington Macaulay drafted the Indian Penal Code in 1837, he incorporated in section 377 the conventional punishment for sodomy that was to spread throughout the British Empire. That code remains in force throughout the subcontinent to this day. It's been copied in various templates in most countries that once were ruled by Britain, and getting rid of that offence outside the United Kingdom and the Old Dominions has proved extremely difficult. In these circumstances, silence on the part of Gandhi might well have been very prudent. Yet he was impish, opinionated, and very vocal. In his autobiography, he described an event which in his youth a friend, probably the same one as tried to convert him to meat, took him to a brothel. He sent me in with the necessary instructions. It was all prearranged, the bill had already been paid. I went into the jaws of sin. But God, in his infinite mercy, protected me against myself. I was almost struck blind and dumb in this den of vice. I sat near the woman on her bed, but I was tongue-tied. She naturally lost patience with me and showed me the door with abuses and insults. I felt as though my manhood had been injured, and I wished to sink into the ground for shame. But I have ever since given thanks to God for having saved me. I can recall 4 more similar incidents in my life, and in most of them, my good fortune, rather than any effort on my part, saved me. This is an interesting, and not, I suggest to you, a universal story of adolescent reticence about sex. Of course, Gandhi was married while still a child. His own first child came along within a year, but was stillborn. He had other children. But by the time he was writing about his life and sexuality, it was mainly in the context of promoting celibacy. Still, he did include in his remarks some that were extended to homosexuality. In the 1930s, 20 years after he had been in South Africa, Gandhi wrote, "The reader should know that even persons of note have been known to approve of what is commonly known as sexual perversion. He may be shocked at the statement, but if it somehow or other gains the stamp of respectability, it will be the rage amongst boys and girls to satisfy their urge amongst members of their own sex. The introduction of contraceptives under the name of science and the imprimatur of known leaders of society has intensified the complication and made the task of reformers who work for purity or social life well nigh impossible for the moment." Gandhi explained his renunciation of sexual, or what he called carnal, relations with his wife in and after his time in South Africa, although most of these categories don't appear to have seen the same consequence in the legal practitioners, social reformers or politicians, vocations that he explained to be the reasons for giving up sex. He said that such activities had required quote, the strictest regulation of sexual life and a rigid practice of non-violence and truth in human relations, whether with my own countrymen or with the Europeans. Over and over again in his writings and speeches, he propounded a view not dissimilar to some traditional Christian beliefs, that sex was not ordained for human pleasure, that it was basically a source of distaste and an outlet for power to be avoided, and it was provided only for procreation. Quote, the couple will never have sexual union for the fulfillment of their lust, but only when they desire issue. I think it is the height of ignorance to think that the sexual act is an independent function necessary like sleeping or eating. These famous writings were offered by Gandhi when he himself avowedly was celibate. Famously, he even adopted a practice by the 1940s of sleeping, albeit in openly accessible living quarters, with a young female relative so as to demonstrate his mastery over the sexual passions which he decried. This caused some eyebrow raising amongst his Congress followers, but he was seemingly trying by a vivid image to demonstrate the self-discipline that he was preaching by his words. To an outsider today, and even perhaps one in the 1930s and 40s, this instruction on sex seemed otherworldly and disconnected with the reality of most lives. To us, it sounds like the failed injunction to young people in the face of AIDS, just say no. The pattern of HIV infection shows that millions of people don't abide by that dictum. Sigmund Freud, at about the same time as Gandhi was writing, declared that celibacy was the one unnatural sexual arrangement for the lives of human beings and indeed for all animal species. The recently publicised experiences of the Christian churches in the West appears to bear out Freud's assessment. Celibacy is intensely uncongenial for most humans and to all animal species. So this is the context in which Lelyfeld's new biography of Gandhi has drawn attention to a known but previously little explored feature of the Mahatma's life in South Africa. I refer to his relationship with Herman Kallenbach. Kallenbach was a lifetime bachelor, a gymnast and a bodybuilder. He was trained by Eugen Sandow, and Sandow was promoted by Flo Ziegfeld of the Ziegfeld Follies fame. He brought his variety of striptease to Johannesburg in 1904. Kallenbach, almost certainly homosexual, boasted a taut body, a feature that Gandhi, when he met him, would have noticed because of his preoccupation with his eating discipline. Some things are certain about their relationship. After Gandhi, by his own account, terminated his sexual relations with his wife, he went, as the whole Indian community knew, to live with Kallenbach in the latter's home in the then upscale white suburb of Johannesburg. According to an assessment by Pradip Sahood, a Gandhi scholar, they were a couple. Kallenbach later remarked that they had lived together, quote, almost in the same bed. The exact nature of the relationship is, of course, contested, and we only have half of the story because Gandhi, unlike Kallenbach, destroyed all the letters. Kallenbach, who was profoundly and sincerely influenced by Gandhi in his ideas, kept all the letters from the Mahatma. They were recently acquired by the National Archives of India, and they have been published. The assessment by Lelyfeld of the nature of the relationship has proved very controversial in India and elsewhere. Even cautious suggestions by the biographer that it was a clearly homoerotic relationship, although not specifically homosexual, caused an outcry. This was condemned as an insult to the father of the nation. Why that should be so is unclear, given that many famous and good people have been homosexual or bisexual. Still, from the terms of Gandhi's letters, it can be said that whether or not there were sexual acts, there was certainly an intense and loving relationship. In 1909, Gandhi wrote to Kalambach from London, "Your portrait, the only one, stands on my mantelpiece in the bedroom. The mantelpiece is opposite to the bed." Gandhi also referred to cotton wool and Vaseline. He said, quote, "These are constant reminders of you." And he went on to explain his mention of this, quote, "It is to show to you and me how completely you have taken possession of my body. This is slavery with a vengeance." Vaseline may be nothing more than a reference to Kalambach's gymnastics, to the administration of enemas in which Gandhi would later engage as a routine. But in earlier times, Vaseline, and long after, was commonly used by heterosexuals and homosexuals for sexual purposes. A century on, who can tell what Gandhi meant? At about this time, Gandhi drafted a mock serious agreement with Kalambach, whom he described as lower house, and Gandhi described himself as upper house. The allusion in these names may have been solely to Kalambach's role as the provider of funds for Gandhi's agitations, or Gandhi's role in disallowing appropriations by Kalambach thought to be extravagant. By this time, Gandhi was insisting on self-denial and true poverty. In London in 1911, when Gandhi was there, the role of the House of Lords, the upper house, was much debated because of the Parliament Act of that year, giving the House of Commons, the lower house, the right ultimately to prevail over the Lords in the case of dispute. For decades later, when they corresponded, Gandhi still used these appellations. They may have been entirely innocent. Some will read them as euphemisms for bottom and top, a classification of sexual roles sometimes used. But they're indications both ways in the letters. In 1908, Kalambach wrote to his brother, telling him, "I've given up my sex life. I've changed my daily life in order to simplify it." Was this truth or a cover? An association of such a close and personal kind was particularly unusual at that time in South Africa because of the different races involved. For Kalambach, it involved having a so-called coloured man in his home. For Gandhi, it was a breach, and a serious one, of his caste obligations, according to which Kalambach was classified as an untouchable. Whatever may have been the exact relationships between the two, it could scarcely have been expected that either of them would have been open or explicit. Equally in South Africa and in India, under the Penal Code, any sexual relationship was not only seriously criminal, it was profoundly disapproved of by social and religious mores. It was held in contempt by the culture of the British Empire. Whilst contemporary conservative political figures in India were horrified at the merest suggestion of any homosexual acts in Gandhi's life, one of his granddaughters, Leela Gandhi, writing in 2002, offered quite a different reaction to the idea. She drew attention to what she called the catalogue of sexual irregularities that was an established feature of India, of the Kama Sutra and of the Ajanta caves. She contrasted this with the nation fraught with repression and anxiety which we have in India today. She wrote, quote, Victorian culture increasingly came to privilege masculinity as the repository of colonial authority, and it simultaneously insisted upon contrasting effeminacy of Indian men as an alibi for conquest. Indian culture internalised this and so set out to recover a lost native masculinity. Both empire and its antagonist, the anti-colonial nation, need to be recognised as profoundly heteronormative projects that found their compelling authorities on the categories of sex, that is, on closed, masculine signifying economy. Against the profoundly patriarchal world of the years of his political activism in India, Gandhi stood valiantly, both for the rights of equality of women, the rights of untouchables, and a willingness to dialogue about sex in a way that was very unusual for the time. Unusual both for its mention and for its message. He enjoyed confrontation and he thrived on dissent. He said, quote, "I've come across men and women in the West who lead a pure life, although they don't accept or observe the current usages and current social conventions. My research runs somewhat in that direction. If you admit the necessity and desirability of reform, of discarding the old wherever necessary, and building a new system of ethics and morals suited to the present age, then the question of seeking permission of others or convincing them just does not arise. A reformer cannot afford to wait until others are converted. He must take the lead and venture forth alone, even in the teeth of universal opposition. Therefore, whatever an opportunity presents itself, I do not evade it or run away from it. On the contrary, I deem it to be my duty, dharma, to meet it squarely in the face and find out where it leads and where I stand." These words, taken from utterances written by Gandhi in later life, may be just general reflections on his personal embrace of celibacy. Still, perhaps Gandhi was renouncing strong passions which had stirred in him in South Africa at the age of 40. Lelyveld, the biographer, does not purport to resolve this riddle. It is presented to the reader, after all, not by the biographer's imagination, but by the course of intense correspondence over many years, written in the spidery but very clear English language handwriting of the Mahatma who walked amongst us. In India, for decades, the politicians in the national legislature could never bring themselves to repeal Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. It required a great independent court of India, the Delhi High Court, and fine judges, Chief Justice A.P. Shah and Justice Muralidharan, to invalidate that part of Macaulay's handiwork as applied Section 377 to consenting adults in private. That was their decision in 2009. The judges emphasised the fundamental principles that Gandhi's struggle for nationhood had achieved in the Constitution of India, drafted by Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, the champion of the untouchables. Those principles, the judges pointed out, included that no group in the diverse Indian Union should be put by their nature into a state of lifelong inequality and disrespect, that equality and the limited intrusion of state power into people's private lives, together with secularism, are fundamental principles of Indian constitutionalism. We must hope that the Supreme Court of India, which has reserved its decision in an appeal against that judgment, will maintain it and endorse it, for it speaks of an India of today and the future, not an India of the colonial and patriarchal past. So what would Gandhi say on this subject? What would he say with the scientific knowledge that we now have? I would suggest he would remind us briefly of his own words. Love and truth are faces of the same coin. Both of them are very difficult to practice, and really, they are the only things worth living for. Our meditation is done. Mahatma Gandhi was a man of controversy and paradoxes, but by any account he was a great leader, an inspired nationalist, a most unusual teacher, a brilliant strategist and tactician. We cannot endorse today all of his ideas taken literally, but he didn't expect that, and he didn't want that from us. He said, quote, "There's no such thing as Gandhiism, and I don't want to leave any sect after me. I do not claim that I've originated any new principle or doctrine. I've simply tried in my own way to apply the eternal truths to our daily life and problems. There is therefore no question of me leaving any code. There can be no comparison between the great lawgivers and me. The opinions I've formed and the conclusions I've arrived at are not final. I may change them tomorrow. I've nothing new to teach the world. Truth and non-violence are as old as the hills. All I've done is to try experiments in both on as vast a scale as I could do. In doing so, I've sometimes erred, and I've learned my lessons. Life and its problems have thus become to me so many experiments in the practice of truth and non-violence. By instincts, I have been truthful but not non-violent. I was capable of sacrificing non-violence for the sake of truth. In fact, it was in the course of my pursuit of truth that I discovered non-violence. Well, all my philosophy, if it may be called by that pretentious name, is contained in what I've said. But you will not call it Gandhiism. There is no ism about it, and no elaborate literature or propaganda is needed about it. Those who believe in the simple truths I've laid down can propagate them only by living them. People have laughed at my spinning wheel, and an acute critic observed that when I die, the wheel will serve to make the funeral pyre. How am I to convince the world by means of books that the whole of my constructive program is rooted in non-violence? My life alone can demonstrate that. Fallible, humorous, witty, playful, determined, sometimes ruthless, unpredictable, rabble-rouser, guru, occasionally misguided, deeply spiritual. A human like the rest of us, but incontestably a great soul. How blessed was India in the father of its nation. Australians and people everywhere can learn for their societies and their own countries, for our species and for the entire biosphere. His central messages remain to challenge us, to disturb us, to shake us out of our complacency, and constantly to require us to search for truth and love in all living things.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you about a mistake I made 30 years ago. As a chairman of the Friends of the Law School here at this university, there weren't many friends in those days, we were told that the best speaker we could get that could fill the room, and we only got 2 people generally, and give us hundreds, was a man by the name of Michael Kirby. And ladies and gentlemen, I didn't have the guts to make the call. And I want to compliment Jenny Lang and Neville Roach for having the guts to do that. Thank God that you did it, and look at the crowd that came. Michael, you did us absolute service. I've heard you so many times, and I don't know how you keep up the consistency. How you manage to research so deeply, how you manage to challenge us, how indeed you manage to shake us, similar to what I think you said Gandhi did as well. You've done us a great service. I am probably going to go home and have some meat, but I'll be thinking about whether I should. It is absolutely appropriate that you be giving this lecture tonight. You've done us proud. We are proud to be associated with you at this university, and long may we do so. We thank you for coming tonight, and I want to thank all who made this possible, and absolutely to thank you all for coming to listen to some inspiration, some well thought through views, and frankly, something that I should have sought to achieve 30 years ago.